You are listening to WMPG 90.9 Gorham, Portland. Live from the Orion Cygnus arm of the Milky Way galaxy, this is Scientifically Speaking, a weekly half-hour program devoted to elegant curiosities, and I am one of your hosts, Sarah Chang. Joining me, as always, is Bernie Ryan, DJ Star Watcher. Bernie is the professor of the astronomy lab at USM and protector of our local night skies, author of the monthly What's Up column in the Portland Press Herald, and Skylights, the official newsletter of the Astronomical Society of Northern New England. Today's show is our part 3 conversation and interview with Chase Stevens, a data scientist working primarily in artificial intelligence at Takeometrics, a startup in Boston. You've been listening to WMPG 90.9 Gorham, Portland. This is Scientifically Speaking, and we're here with the absolutely amazing Chase Stevens, data scientist over at Takeometrics. And our show is all about 5G today.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so how does 5G relate to some of the newest advances in artificial intelligence? And how is that required? I know it's required for automated cars and all that.
Yes. So one of the I guess paradigm shifts in how computing technology has worked is we've equivocated, we've gone back and forth through the history of computing, but the sort of traditional notions of you have something on your computer and your computer has to be powerful enough to run a machine learning model or what have you, or even to train a machine learning model. We have shifted away from that and sort of consolidated around our approach, which is often referred to as the cloud, where as opposed to you having to own a very expensive, a very powerful computer that you probably aren't going to be using 99% of the time, you can sort of ad hoc be using someone else's resources, which may be provided to you on a payment basis. So I can go today to Amazon and go to their web services department and say, hey, please get me a really powerful or 100 really powerful computers to sort of train my artificial intelligence model on. Or I can, if you are a Google or something like that, you might be offering that free. Or Amazon Alexa is a very good example of sort of the speech recognition that's being done there. Primarily is not being done on your little, I don't know how much they cost, $50 Alexa device. But instead, what you've said is sent over to Amazon servers. They very quickly and much more powerfully are decoding what you're saying and then sort of responding back and doing whatever you asked it to do, right? So one limitation there, or one component of that, is both latency and sort of speed or bandwidth. And so as we rely more and more on these sort of sophisticated artificial technology advances in our day-to-day lives, we are getting better at making those more efficient, and there might be some advances in the future that are going to make those more realistic to run on sort of your personal devices or train on your personal devices. But so far, we've been leaning pretty heavily on these sort of centralized computing resources. And so the development of 5G is sort of one in a long line of advances in basically bringing those sort of higher throughput availability cellular connections to more people. So as we sort of open up that gap, the bandwidth gap there, especially in the US, where traditionally, because we developed our internet communication technology so early, we've lagged behind some of the nations who have sort of more recently sort of done that infrastructure work. The ability for us to send these what can be quite large in terms of the amount of data models between different computers, or these large inputs like, you know, everything the computer the camera on your autonomous vehicle is seeing, things like that. The more we can reliably use that connection, the more interesting things we can do. So as an example, I'm going to probably get this incorrect, the actual company, but I think it was Netflix recently, or maybe it was NVIDIA. Anyway, was working on a technique where, you know, when you're playing computer games with someone else or having a Zoom call like we are right now, transporting the actual video can be really daunting from a bandwidth perspective, especially if you have other things going on your computer, or you have a, you know, very slow connection or things like that. So one means of circumventing that is to use something like a deep fake, where I can just say, I have a model of my face, which might be several 100 megabytes in size. Instead of sending you this sort of continuous video feed of me, I'm going to be sending you the model of me, so your sort of 3D model of Chase Stevens. And on my end, I'm going to take the video input, sort of run it through that model backwards to get some very, I guess, small compressed representation of what my face looks like that you can then reconstruct on your end with your model, right? So it doesn't work exactly this way, but you could imagine that if I had points that are, you know, marking the corners of my mouth and the corners of my eyes and where my nose is, that I could sort of use just those very few points to dictate what my face looks like and have you reconstruct it. But to be able to do that, especially on something like a cell phone or whatever, you need to download the model of my face first. And that on a slow or on a traditional connection is something that's going to take, I don't know, minutes, hours, depending on how good the cell signal is. The better the cell signal, the faster we can do that, and the more sort of interesting applications that will open up.
That almost sounds like a hologram.
Yeah.
So I'm not 100% sure on, I think, what's the claim with holograms. With holograms, the idea is that you can use a lower dimensional representation to create a higher dimensional. So, you know, the one on the back of your credit card is a 2D image in reality, but when you look at it, it looks 3D.
Right.
So it is a similar concept in that you are trying to sort of compress a large amount of data into something that's lower dimensionality to reconstruct on the other end.
I know we were talking about sound and video. I remember a couple of years ago, I had this great idea of transmitting smell. You know, like you'd have on your end all the pieces to be able to construct it, but there's something that breaks it down, and then it'll on the other side.
Yeah, smell's a really difficult one because you know, when you're smelling things, that's the physical interaction between a particular molecule or set of molecules with your sort of olfactory receptors. There's an amusing anecdote. So I forget exactly who it was. I think it was Pierre Norvig that has this story of there were some students in a lab, and they thought to themselves, if we could only isolate the sort of molecule or set of molecules in whiskey that makes whiskey taste like whiskey. You know, whiskey, I think all hard liquors start out as being essentially, once you've distilled them, 100% alcohol, and then you add in water and, you know, put it in an oaken barrel and, you know, wait for it to age. And that's where, you know, bourbon and whiskey and all these sorts of things are getting their flavor from. They start out as pure alcohol, and then we sort of adulterate them. So they were thinking, well, if we can figure out this one compound that makes that, you know, you get through 5 or 10 years of aging whiskey in a barrel, we can just add that directly into the alcohol, and we'll be able to, you know, produce this really great tasting, really cheap whiskey. So they did some research. They isolated the compound. I think they ordered a little bit of some various compounds from a distributor. I don't know if they were online. I think this predates ordering things online, but they got it in through the catalog or whatever. They tasted it. It tasted great, and so they thought, all right, well now we can use this commercially. So they wrote back to the company and they said, all right, well please send us back a 55-gallon drum full of this compound. And the company wrote back and said, well, we'd love to fulfill your order, but unfortunately, as you know, the way we make this compound is by aging in oaken barrel for 10 years, and so we won't be able to fulfill your order quantity. So with smells, I think unfortunately until we get to the sort of Star Trek matter replicator stage of things, where we can sort of piece the molecules together bit by bit, I think past the sort of scratch and sniff, very limited set of scents, we're not quite there yet, but.
Yeah, it took us way off course. But no, that was so it's a good point to make, because I guess frequency is a little easier to deal with right now, wavelengths and stuff like that.
Yes.
So going back to 5G, one of the barriers that rural families face is they often don't have broadband, they don't have satellite internet, and kids who can't go to school and they're doing school virtually. This is a potential solution for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a double-edged sword, right? So it is critical, and like I was saying, in the US especially, where our infrastructure is getting a little out of date, to be able to, and also where our country is so large, to be able to have a wireless communications protocol that is bringing those sort of broadband-esque speeds to people who otherwise wouldn't be accessible to, and at low latency. So satellites, if you imagine sort of the signal that you're producing has to go all the way into space and back down. And if you're trying to talk to someone else, that's going to introduce lag, or whatever you're trying to play a video game or whatever, that's undesirable. So it's important to have these sort of very low latency, high bandwidth mediums available to us. On the other hand, you don't want that to be disrupted, I guess, right? But cybersecurity, we're already such a mess in that regard, that I don't even know that's the if you were looking to cause trouble, I don't know if that's the first thing you'd reach for. I think the power grid is a much more interesting target in that regard.
Yeah. So how widespread is 5G now in this country? Is only small parts of the country that have it, or?
Well, so it depends. I believe there are two variants of 5G. So there's one that's slightly lower bandwidth that operates at a lower frequency, and one that's more of those sort of broadband speeds, or pretty good broadband speeds that are at a higher frequency. So I believe they're at 20 and 60 or so gigahertz respectively. That lower frequency, I think, has been deployed to a large part of the US. I don't know exactly the coverage figures there. The sort of higher frequency, shorter wavelength communications medium is in some ways a little inherently shorter range. So those are mostly being deployed to really high density areas like cities and things like that. So I think that even in the long term, that particular frequency is not going to be that widespread, but the lower frequency one I think is relatively widespread right now.
Yeah. Now, I know some countries are having problems with other countries developing that for them for security reasons and being able to build data that comes through that. I know it's just a channel, but if some of the Chinese company, I think England didn't allow them to finish their system for them or something.
Yes, Huawei, I think, is the company there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's more of a, I mean, there's some really interesting stories there too. I know that I read an interesting anecdote from a hardware manufacturer who was getting, I don't remember the company on their side, but getting some chips from a company in China, maybe larger than chips, maybe entire boards or something like this. But they they started realizing that well, when we're getting these, some of them are slightly heavier than others, and that's because there's a little sort of spy chip that's been soldered onto there. So they started having to weigh the boards, and then the Chinese manufacturer had some sort of means of circumventing that weight by maybe adding, if they have a little spy chip there, then that's that weight. If they don't, then they have some other dummy weight that they put into the box or what have you. So I think ultimately the solution there was they had to rotate them and measure the angular momentum or something along these lines when they rotated the boards to try and discover where these sort of spy devices had been hidden. But that's that's always something that's going to be a challenge, right? It's for the average person especially, it's not feasible for you to be inspecting the components of your laptop. You might not, most laptops now you can't even really open them up to inspect the contents. Yeah, there are always means of sort of circumventing the security measures that we would like to have in place. And as stands right now, there's not a good solution to that, except for the fact that for most people, their lives are not interesting enough to warrant, a nation state like China deliberately trying to target you as an individual person and get your information. So most people are safe. And then for, matters of sort of national security or whatever, there's a lot more scrutiny that can go into making sure that things are up to snuff.
Actually, I'm curious about that. I mean, I know I've heard Bernie say it before too, where I'm not that interesting. It doesn't matter if they're tracking me. But
right.
I mean, again, like they're not really tracking us individually. Is there anything that they would get or gain from being able to track the mass, like the population?
Well, so definitely having large aggregate data on people can be a very powerful tool. I mean, the NSA famously has been doing a lot of data collection, and I'm sure there are some interesting applications on their end of things that none of us are privy to. But the real question is sort of almost a game theoretic one of what's the payoff for the person trying to do this. So, most computer hackers or what have you, they're trying to circumvent security systems, are people who are looking to find the lowest hanging fruit and to exploit that, right? So computers that are severely out of date, computers that have had their security settings messed with and things like this, right? That's really where you get the sort of best payoff for effort. Similar to spam emails. I know if you go through your spam filter, you are probably thinking to your, which I hardly do anymore. They've gotten so good that it's not necessary. But if you read some of those emails that have been blocked, you look at it and you think, well, who's going to believe that the Crown Prince of Nigeria has $1 trillion waiting for me in his bank account? I'll only help him. And the answer is, it's deliberately bad because they want to find the very sort of gullible people that would believe that, because those are the only people worth spending the effort on. So I don't know to what extent that answers your question, but.
No, I think that's fair. Basically, it sounds like as long as your defenses are up, who cares?
Yeah, and I mean, for better or for worse, the way that technology has been going is automatic updates that are sort of pushing these security patches. So you more and more increasingly, you have less control of your computer. And the idea behind that is to keep you safer.
Yeah. Interesting.
So how does all these new satellites that Elon Musk is launching, the Starlinks, I think 2 weeks, will they help a lot with 5G, or what's the purpose behind that? You said the latency with satellites might slow it down, or?
Yeah, so my understanding, I'm not intimately familiar with that, but my understanding is to just be able to have ubiquitous internet service all across the globe, which satellites are very good at. But traditionally speaking, the sort of issue has been you have to have a dish that's sufficient for picking up on the satellite signals, that's set up in a very precise way. And obviously, if you're in an area where there's already not sufficient infrastructure to allow you to have, a decent internet connection, probably getting that dish to your home and setting up is not going to be super feasible. So there have been a few sort of approaches to that. I know that Google a few years ago were going to try and deploy, I think, weather balloons that would be acting as sort of relays for internet data. And they had a few test runs I believe in New Zealand, but I don't know. They probably decided it wasn't profitable enough and scrapped it or something like that. But it's a concept that has been around for a while, trying to have some easy way of getting internet access everywhere. Whether Starlink in particular will succeed in that regard, who knows? I think Elon Musk is the sort of guy who likes to just take every crazy idea that he comes up with and stick some well-paid scientists on it and see where he gets. But I guess we'll see.
Are we working on 6G yet? What would that be? We don't even have 5G yet.
You're just asking about the rollout of 5G. No, what about 6G?
Well, no, let's keep going. I mean, it's just a generation.
Well, first of all, there are some regulatory issues around the communication spectrum and what parts of that the FCC will allow you to use and what parts won't. But also, various wavelengths also have different sort of absorption properties in terms of everyday objects, the atmosphere, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So my understanding is that so far we've had a problem where as the bandwidth goes up, the sort of signal strength or the amount it disperses over area, signal strength goes down, the dispersion goes up. So hence the differentiation in 5G between the sort of lower and higher bandwidth tiers there.
So how much of a jump is 5G over 4G?
I believe it's at least an order of magnitude or two. So if I recall correctly, 5G is supposed to be purportedly up to 100 megabytes per second, 100 megabits rather per second, which would be comparable to a pretty good home connection. I think in the US, you'd be lucky to see a home connection that exceeds maybe 300 megabits per second. So, decently comparable, let's say, as opposed to,
we don't have a lot of options here in Portland area, in Maine in general.
Yeah.
So then theoretically, of course, 6G would be an order of magnitude above that.
Maybe. I don't know. I think that'll probably depend on the engineering constraints. And also with all these sorts of things, it's a matter of you sort of have to get the entire industry rallied around it. So if you T-Mobile and I don't even know what the Verizon, are those still separate companies? If you two can't agree on exactly how this should work or what the constraints are going to be in terms of having to support that from how the phones are manufactured, you sort of have to have this entire consortium that everyone gets together and agrees, and that process can also take quite a while. So it's not so much, I guess, a issue with the limitations of the state of the art, but more everyone coming to consensus on how the next rollout and next iteration is going to work.
Do you know anything about the, I feel like I kept hearing the health impacts of 5G.
Oh yeah, I was just ask about that. That's a good question. Yeah.
So I guess in terms of what the scientific literature supports right now, there are none. We've done research. I'm sure people will remember when sort of the advent of cell phones, what seems like a million years ago, but 20 or so, 30 or so years ago, if you had a really big, car phone or something like that, people were very concerned about, well, will this give me cancer or things like that? And fundamentally, I mean, we can sort of take this question two ways. So from a research perspective, there have been plenty of studies done trying to see, well, is there some sort of correlation or relationship between cell phone usage, especially, I think there was one study that looked at, well, people who hold the cell phone up to their head with their right hand versus their left hand, and whether that would cause cancer in, the corresponding right or left hemispheres of the brain or anything like that. And so far, there has been no evidence that there's any sort of relationship there. But in terms also of just from a sort of common sense scientific perspective, it's not super plausible, which is why these claims, typically speaking, are not taken so seriously.
Right.
The sort of radiation that, the sort of, I guess, frequency that all these cell signals are operating at is well below sort of the ionizing radiation boundary that that humans and other living organisms are vulnerable to. So it's really like a matter of, imagine getting hit by a fly, right? That flies into you. That's sort of like the analogous to cell phone radiation versus a bullet that hits you, right? So it's a matter of what's the energy impact of that photon that's hitting your body, and how much damage can it cause as a part of that. And it hopefully shouldn't surprise people too much to hear that's not a concern. Evolution certainly has done a great deal in terms of preparing the human body for adverse circumstances or things that might be harmful to us, and for the sort of wavelengths of light that are harmful to us, like UV light, which the sun produces in abundance.
Yeah.
If you step outside, you may be familiar with this phenomenon of tanning, where you go outside, there's UV light, and your body responds by producing melanin, or however that works, around
That's a new
the
concept,
nucleus.
right? That's pretty new, right?
Yeah. and so if you look at your body when you have a tan in the UV spectrum, it's a lot darker because your body's producing melanin to absorb that and protect your DNA, right? Or if you ever take a look at UV footage of people applying sunscreen, in UV, it looks like you're smearing mud all over your face. It's really wild. So, but there exists no such mechanism for these sort of microwave or radio frequencies, which are, like I said, pretty low risk. The body doesn't really respond to those in any way that we know of, because they're not dangerous, right?
Even visible light has a much lower frequency than the microwave or the radio. And
yes, visible light is much more energetic, yes, by many orders of magnitude. Yeah. And even that doesn't really adversely affect us.
I mean, as you said, UV, now that's more powerful than visible. And of course, X-rays aren't good for you, and neither are gamma rays.
No, and that's an important point too, is that a lot of these, if you think about what causes harm to the body, it's really when these sort of rays of light are interacting with your body, right? So if you look at an X-ray, the reason why X-rays are dangerous is because you take an X-ray of someone, you can see, all the X-rays were absorbed by the bones, right? If you try and take a microwave picture of someone, you're not going to get very far, because it's all just going straight through you. If you have your cell phone clasped in your hands, the cell phone still works, right? Yeah. So that's why it's not so dangerous for us.
Yeah, it's a very good point, actually. It's like just a great way to visualize it. You've been listening to Scientifically Speaking here on WMPG with myself, Bernie, and Chase Stevens. Thank you so much for coming on our show and
my pleasure.
Talking about artificial intelligence. We talked about deep fakes. We talked about computers writing stories. We talked about 5G, a whole host of things, all for your listening pleasure. Stay tuned for Sports Jam with Colin and Connor. And from your favorite nerds, mask up, and we wish you healthy bodies and clean air.